we decided to look at resilience in individuals who have been really severely traumatized, prisoners of war, former prisoners of war from Vietnam. And then we also looked at instructors, special forces instructors, because we figured, these guys are going to know how to train for resilience. And we also interviewed in-depth interviews, a large number of civilians, men, women, children who had been through very adverse circumstances, but were doing remarkably well, nevertheless. And in fact, what we found is that many of these remarkable individuals had grown as a result of these overwhelming traumas. There's a fascinating body of research on exercise, and one of the things that happens when we become physically fit is that this helps to modulate the stress response and my response to emotional stimuli, so that I actually contain or regulate, for example, the sympathetic nervous system, adrenaline, noradrenaline, and the HPA axis, cortisol. I regulate those better if I'm in good physical condition. And those are very much related to how I experience emotions. There's a wonderful pediatrician named George Winnicott, and he coined the term the good enough mother. And it applies to the good enough father, the good enough coach, the good enough mentor. And by good enough, he meant the best. So good enough is the best. And what good enough means is I know when my kid or mentee or whatever is in over their head. I'm observant. I'm trying not to let them get really overwhelmed. But I'm also not going to overprotect them. I'm going to let them experiment, challenge themselves, fail, regroup, and so forth.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Bounce Podcast. Many of us have either already or certainly will experience a major setback in our lives. Perhaps you've lost a job. Many are going through divorce or worse. You've experienced physical or mental trauma. Somewhere on the spectrum, you will or are facing challenges. If so, I would encourage you to keep listening or refer this episode to someone who could use it. My guest is Dr. Stephen Southwick, who, along with Dennis Charney, are the co-authors of Resilience, The Science of Mastering Life's Greatest Challenges. The book summarizes research into psychological, biological, and the social impact of trauma, and it combines the latest scientific findings in the area of resilience, drawing on 2 decades of work with trauma survivors. Stephen is a recognized expert on the psychological and neurobiological effects of extreme psychological trauma. He completed his psychiatry residency at Yale University School of Medicine. He is the Glenn H. Greenberg Professor of Psychiatry, PTSD, and Resilience at Yale University Medical School and Yale Child Study Center. He is also the medical director of the Clinical Neuroscience of the Veterans Affairs National Center for PTSD, and he's the adjunct professor of psychiatry, Mount Sinai School of Medicine. He has worked with a wide range of trauma survivors, including combat veterans, civilian children and adults with PTSD, and very high-functioning, stress-resilient former prisoners of war and active duty Special Forces and Navy SEALs soldiers. On this episode, we talk about his research into resilience and PTSD and what led him to kind of write the book, the types of research used for the book, his interest in studying resilience, how he defines it. We go into human physiology, how the brain may work against you in traumatic or challenging circumstances, why and how each of us differ in our response to stress and in our resilience levels. And then he kind of takes me through some resilience factors, what survivors do to successfully cope with extreme circumstances. He talks about active toughening, stress inoculators, the importance of recovery, how to recover. We talk about social pain and the importance of social networks. That was very interesting to me. We get into isolation, and I talk about how I kind of struggle with that. We also talk about what he asks someone who's suffering when they first come to him for help. Just 2 housekeeping items here. One is my impression of Stephen was that he has a very, very tender temperament, and he would be the first person I would want to talk to if I was going through something tough. And I think that comes across in the audio. The other is Stephen had a cold and still agreed to come on so which I appreciate, but occasionally you'll hear a sniffle or two. So anyway, without further ado, here is Stephen. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Very excited to talk to you. So you're an MD,
Yes.
and are you currently a professor of psychiatry with kind of a focus on PTSD and resilience at Yale?
Correct.
And I believe the Yale Child Study Center?
Yes.
Okay.
And I spent a lot of time at the Veterans Hospital, the Connecticut Veterans Hospital that is affiliated with Yale.
And the book, is that a result of your work there?
Well, the book, Dennis Charney, co-author, and I worked and studied post-traumatic stress disorder for many years, mostly with combat veterans, but also civilians. And obviously, we did a lot of that through the Veterans Hospital. And at one point, when Dennis went down to the National Institute of Mental Health, we decided to look at resilience as well as PTSD. You can be very resilient and still have PTSD. They're not the opposite. But we decided to look at resilience in individuals who have been really severely traumatized, prisoners of war, former prisoners of war from Vietnam. And then we also looked at instructors, special forces instructors, because we figured, these guys are going to know how to train for resilience. And we also interviewed in-depth interviews, a large number of civilians, men, women, children who had been through very adverse circumstances, but were doing remarkably well, nevertheless. And in fact, what we found is that many of these remarkable individuals had grown as a result of these overwhelming traumas.
So there's a book called Aging Well. There's a Harvard psychologist, I think his name is George Valiant. He describes it as resilient individuals resembling a twig with a fresh, green living core. When twisted out of shape, the twig bends, but it doesn't break, right? It springs back and continues growing. To me, that's beautiful. Is there a clinical definition for it?
Well, I think that's a great definition. And we basically see it that way as well, bending but not breaking, bouncing back, sometimes growing even stronger. And it's really the ability to deal well with highly stressful situations and to manage them well. And from a biological standpoint, we might think of it as the ability to modulate or even constructively harness the stress response.
So it seems domain specific. Is it? So an individual, it's going to vary. And some people are responding to adversity at work that are listening to this podcast. Some people with a marriage or grief. Is it domain specific?
That's a good question. Yes, people can be very resilient in some domains of their life, but not so much in others. Just as you suggest, someone might be quite resilient at work, but not so much in relationships. And the other thing is that resilience may vary over the course of one's life. So, for example, one might not be as resilient as a child, but as an adult be very resilient. So it varies between domains and at various time points in one's life.
And then to further that question, if I build up resilience in one domain, can it bleed or does it bleed into other areas?
Yes, because for many reasons. For example, if I become physically fit and I engage in really challenging activities and I master those activities, that tends to increase my self-confidence, which, as you said, bleeds over to all sorts of domains. And it's pretty well known that enhancing physical resilience will actually enhance emotional resilience.
Well, that's interesting in the sense that me getting to my body is easier than getting to my brain. In other words, I can go to the gym and work out or put myself in a tough situation physically to work on muscles or what have you, where things like that could build up some type of physical resilience that may help for my mental state.
Very much so. There's a fascinating body of research on exercise. And one of the things that happens when we become physically fit is that this helps to modulate the stress response and my response to emotional stimuli so that I actually contain or regulate, for example, the sympathetic nervous system, adrenaline, noradrenaline, and the HPA axis, cortisol. I regulate those better if I'm in good physical condition. And those are very much related to how I experience emotions.
Wow.
Another thing that happens with exercise and getting physically fit is that I tend to increase some of the neurotransmitters like dopamine or like serotonin that are and endorphins that are related to my mood. So exercise tends to improve mood, lessen anxiety. It also enhances your cognitive function. So there's a great study that was done not long ago looking at 70-year-olds, half of whom exercised just moderately. I think it was 3 times a week for 45 minutes versus a similar group who just stretched for that period of time over the course of a year. And those who exercised versus stretched had a improvement in their cognitive function, not huge, but enough to make a difference. They had an increase in the size of their hippocampus. And the hippocampus is an area of the brain that is essential for learning and for regulating the stress response. So their memories were a little bit better. Their hippocampus actually grew in size, but the other group, the hippocampus decreased in size a small amount because our hippocampus tends to decrease as we age. So this was quite a remarkable study showing that there was an improvement in memory function and actually a neurobiological correlate of that.
And this is through exercise.
Exercise is, in my opinion, one of the magic elixirs. It helps so many physical issues and emotional and mental issues. There are some studies, and I'm not saying this is definitive because there need to be more studies, but as effective as antidepressants or cognitive behavioral treatments for moderate depressions. So what we tend to do is, sure, we'll use an antidepressant, we'll use psychotherapy, but we will also prescribe exercise for depression.
That's very interesting that the hippocampus is affected via exercise and the memory and everything. But so it makes me think of the benefit of hard things, at least the benefit of putting yourself in a voluntary position of a hard thing or difficulty as kind of training. You know, Stoic philosophy is kind of the hot thing now, especially out in the valley. But in my journaling, either in the morning and at night, I have a checkbox for grit points. In other words, meditation, I check off that I scored 2 points, grit. And then I also have a little tick mark for finding a parking place further away from where I want to go, just to try to increase my frustration tolerance level. Does that make sense? So I'm doing these little things every day just to try to make myself a little more resilient when it comes to everyday frustrations or things of that nature. And I have exercise in there as well.
One way that we look at this is you can look at 2 types of toughening. So there's passive toughening and there's active toughening. Passive toughening would be, look, we're all going to be faced with a huge number of challenges during our life. They're coming our way whether we like it or not. And if we can change our mindset, and it's not easy to do, to look at this stressor or challenge that is coming my way or that is here, and see if there's something we can learn from this, and view it as a challenge rather than something adverse, a challenge rather than a threat, or at least part challenge. So that's passive toughening. It's coming my way anyway. Why not see if I can learn something from this? There's active toughening, which you were just mentioning, where I intentionally go out and challenge myself to whatever. It could be learning to meditate and doing it more and more and more. Stress inoculation is where you get a little tougher. You make the challenge a little tougher, then a little tougher. The military is great at this. You know, you pass one course, and then you go to the one that's the next little tougher, and then the one that's a little tougher, and you get stronger and stronger and stronger in that activity. If I want to run a marathon, I don't run 26 miles the first day. I do a mile, and then 2 miles, 3 miles, And if I do this in a systematic way, I get pretty darn tough. And I feel good about myself because we all love mastery. So this idea of stress inoculation, passive toughening, it's there anyway, it's coming my way. How can I use this? Or active toughening, I'm just as you're doing, I'm going to challenge myself. And we grow the most when we are out of our comfort zone, but not truly overwhelmed.
So I love the phrase stress inoculation. I love that.
Mhm.
It does so many things. First of all, it's a thing, but it's a reframe of what stress, or, you're looking at something differently.
Yeah, so
Um,
the point is not to avoid stress.
right.
The point is to try to harness it and master it and grow from it. Is a big part of resilience is knowing how to recover. So there is a beautiful book by a gentleman, Sapolsky, who wrote a book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And the example he uses is a zebra gets chased by a lion, has a huge stress response, adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol, to keep it alive. But as soon as it's out of danger, the stress response comes back to baseline. That's how it's supposed to work. But with humans, we have this very fancy prefrontal cortex, which is great, which allows us to ruminate about the past. Oh my gosh, I almost got eaten by a lion, my God. And to anticipate, oh my gosh, what happens if I see a lion again? But the prefrontal cortex allows us to be human and is great. But we also tend to or can ruminate or stay stressed 24/7. So one of the keys in resilience is, just as you suggested, is knowing how to recover. And there is a whole science to that. There's meditation, there's mindfulness, there's sleep hygiene, etc.
So as we're talking, I'm kind of collecting the notes as to how we can be more resilient. Obviously, if you've just gone through something tough, take some time, rest, to make sure you're eating properly, all that kind of thing. And then to kind of build up the resilience, exercise does it, and things that, as you call them, stress inoculators, where stress inoculation do things to make yourself progressively stronger, and a toughening process. There's probably a few categories of people listening. One, there's people not going through anything tough right now, right? So everything's status quo, everything's fine. But the shit's going to hit the fan. Something's going to happen. Even though you're not being pulled in because you have acute need, and that's usually the problem. People tend to search for this information on resilience when there's an acute need, and it's it's not too late, but it would be beneficial to think about this beforehand. So those type of people, I would say, listen up and prepare your bed before you sleep in it, so to speak, because you're going to need this. And then there's the people they're really going through it right now. So to that point, what do we say to those people?
One of the most important factors that we learned about and written about is social connectedness. So when we interviewed all of these remarkable prisoners of war, they uniformly said that what really kept them alive, or one of the most important factors, was that they learned to communicate by something called a tap code, which is similar to the Morse code, through the prison walls. And they were tapping constantly for one another, communicating in all sorts of ingenious ways. And, humans, we are built to be connected to other humans. And it appears that the brain evolved in such a way that when we are lonely, when we feel rejected, when there's any threat of exclusion, the brain activates the fight-flight response, and a number of areas of the brain similar to the areas that are the same as the areas that are activated during physical pain. So our ancestors did not want to be by themselves away from a group, or they wouldn't pass their genes on. They would be killed. So our neurobiology is such that any form of social exclusion, or even the threat, is exquisitely painful. It's called social pain. And sometimes you think, why would that be so painful? It's built into your nervous system. We have to be with other people. And social connectedness is enormously powerful in terms of enhancing resilience. When we talk to, let's say, the Navy SEALs or the Special Forces, you might say, you do some very dangerous things and you seem to be very brave. Almost everyone will say, no, it's not me, it's my squad. And so, to me, one of, if not the most important factors, is to have a squad, to have a group of individuals who you really care about, who you know, at least one or two, who you know will come to your aid no matter what, and to whom you will go as well, because the data on how social connectedness from a neurobiological and a psychological standpoint enhances resilience is extremely compelling. And there's more recent data showing that giving support to others may be more powerful in terms of healing and resilience than receiving it. So both ways, giving and receiving. So one of the first things that I do now, after doing all these, interviewing all these amazing people who became our teachers, quite honestly, is when I see someone who's coming in for help, who's suffering, one of the first things that I do is I say, let's draw a diagram of your social network. Who do you see on a regular basis? Who can you count on? And if that social network looks rather frail, we work on that because it's so critically important.
Why do we then want to isolate? I may be speaking for myself. Sometimes if I'm going through something, I just want to be by myself. Is that a universal thing, or is
no? I think my read on this is that that's kind of an American and a Western European thing. Other cultures that I've worked with, you don't see that nearly as much. Much more communal. Resilience is far more communal. We learned, rugged individualism, America, the cowboy. We've been indoctrinated with this all along, but it's not the healthiest way to live.
Is there a difference in gender for that?
Yeah, women tend to feel more comfortable sharing their frailties. Men, have to be really tough and so forth, but it doesn't really work.
So to that point, I want to bring that up because we need to push through it, whoever it is. If you have a tendency to isolate, you need to push through that. If you don't want to elongate, or if you want to reduce this emotional impact or shorten it at least.
Not only that, but social isolation is as toxic to health and the number of years you're going to live during your life. It's as bad as cigarette smoking, as a sedentary lifestyle. It really shortens your lifespan. But after doing these studies, I realized that the highly resilient people tend not to do that.
So you brought up the brain, and I want to get into it because there's a great book. You probably read it, I don't know, sure, but it's called Surviving Survival, Lawrence Gonzalez. And basically, he talks about how people have survived crisis, trauma, disease, accident, whatever, and getting their life back after they've kind of come through it. But one of his main threads through the book is how the brain has reacted and the memories that are burned in from the trauma. So any sight, sound, smell of the scene where they were threatened sets off automatic behavior. So it'll narrow focus and reduce what options are really there. So this wonderful brain that we have and useful systems for forming, important memories, all of a sudden works on a job with no practical value, right? In fact, it works against us.
Well, that's exactly right. But I think it's important to look at this as an adaptive survival mechanism of the brain. So we tend to look at post-traumatic stress disorder and so forth as, oh, that's unhealthy. Well, as you say, if you were still in the dangerous situation, the symptoms of PTSD would actually largely be adaptive. So if I'm in a dangerous situation, I want to sleep with one eye open. I want to be vigilant. I want to remember all the stimuli that are dangerous. I don't want 7 trial learning to figure out what a tiger is. I want 1 trial learning. And the brain has a mechanism to do that. So if you think about your own life, what do you remember best? You remember things that occurred when you were emotionally aroused, when you were happy, sad, angry, or afraid. That's because chemicals like norepinephrine were elevated in the amygdala, the fear center, which shoved the memories into the brain in a more profound way. That is adaptive. What also happens is that, as you said, the entire context is shoved into the brain. So the sights, the smells, everything that was present at the time of the trauma. The problem is, as you say, if let's suppose I'm a World War II vet in the South Pacific and I see a child killed on a hot and muggy day at sunset, I remember this vividly. But let's say haven't thought about it for a long time and so forth. But I notice that I feel nervous on hot and muggy days. I don't have any idea why, because this fear conditioning occurs below the cortex in the limbic system. So I'm not consciously aware of it. Or maybe at sunset, I always get a little nervous. I have no idea why. However, if enough cues are present, like I see a child who's about to get injured, it's sunset and so forth, maybe it retrieves the whole memory. Now, what therapy is largely about, or much of the therapy is about, or variations of therapy, is about learning about this process. But once you understand, the worst thing is to be bombarded by emotions you don't understand. I'm afraid, I don't know why, what's wrong with me? Well, guess what? It's sunset. That was part of the memory. Now, once I understand that, I can take my prefrontal cortex, conscious, and say, oh, that was then, this is now, I'm actually safe. So the prefrontal cortex has now inhibited the fear centers, the amygdala and so forth. But without conscious awareness, my amygdala is just going to keep doing this. And you may not completely get over it, but you can reduce the arousal and the fear and so forth dramatically.
And part of that is just being aware of what's going on. So you kind of know, wait a minute, I'm being hijacked here. This is going to pass, but this is a false alarm. Maybe talk to yourself, hey, you're fine. This is just sunset. You're just kicked off.
But you have to understand that first.
And this is where maybe cultivating optimism can help as well.
Optimism is huge.
I think optimism gets a bad rap.
It does. It's the one way to look at it is, and this is one way, is to look at it as a habitual way of explaining events to yourself. And Martin Seligman has done a lot of work on this. An example might be a pessimist, could be me, takes an algebra test and flunks it. So the pessimist says, oh my gosh, I flunked this test. I'm so stupid. I'm terrible in all subjects. I'll never get into college. I'll end up being a homeless person. So what has that person done? They have catastrophized, they've made it terrible, and they've generalized it to all areas of their life. Now the optimist, and this is a habitual way of explaining events to yourself. The optimist would say, ooh, too bad I flunked that test, but I'm pretty good in the other subjects. Maybe I didn't study enough, or maybe math's not my thing. I'll be okay. So that person has not catastrophized and not generalized. There's a therapy called learned optimism, which is a form of cognitive behavior therapy developed by Martin Seligman, which teaches you to pay attention to what you're saying.
By the way, I'm going to push that book. I think the book is called Learned Optimism. And by the way, we're not talking about magical thinking. We're actually trying to counter unrealistic negative thoughts, right? In other words, we're predicting the future in a negative way, which you have no idea that's what's going to happen.
Optimism isn't associated with resilience. Realistic optimism is associated with resilience, because if you're overly rose-colored optimism, you tend to underestimate the threat. You don't prepare enough, and you just don't handle things as well.
It goes back to the brain working against us, right? I mean, it's fight or flight. We're made to survive. All this evolution works against us, and we sometimes tend to default negative just from a survival standpoint, even though it's just office politics or something.
Well,
right?
Well, the brain is built in a way that we tend to focus on negative before positive. That's the way our brains are built, and that's a survival thing. It also, good old Norman Vincent Peale, there is evidence that intentionally, quote, inserting positive thoughts or trying to can be helpful as well as acting as if you're optimistic. So, in other words, behaving in a way that an optimist might behave, because, if we want to change ourselves, we can do that by trying to regulate our thoughts, which is very difficult, but at least be aware of the distortions in our thoughts and see how realistic they are. But we can also change our behaviors. And interestingly, if we change our behaviors, our thoughts tend to follow after a while.
I like act as if you're optimistic.
The best you can, yeah. And also the other thing is that optimism and pessimism are quite infectious. So if you're around people who are pessimistic, that's not going to be good for your mood. On the other hand, if you can be around at least some optimistic people, that tends to help.
You mentioned in the book the benefit of reappraisal. Something bad has happened or something's challenging, you're in the middle of it. But if you can reappraise it to say, what is good in this? What can be good? Or what good can come out of this? Just a form of reappraisal gets you to that kind of optimistic perspective that's realistic. There's many times that good has come out of things that are interpreted as bad at the moment, or could be.
Right. Is there anything I can learn from this?
There you go. Yes.
Is there any opportunity here for learning or for growing or so forth? And post-traumatic growth is an important topic that I personally am very interested in, but that may take a while. It's not as if, I'll just change it. Well, painful experiences are painful, but there are some remarkable examples of people who are able to turn tragedies into triumphs of sorts.
So you do recommend getting back on the horse. Is this addressing anxiety?
Yes.
Yeah.
One of the things that we tend to do with fear and anxiety, and it's very natural, we tend to avoid situations that make us anxious or afraid. The problem is that restricts our life because we avoid various opportunities and so forth. And avoidance does not work. So with anxiety disorders like panic disorder or PTSD, the successful psychotherapies are all incorporate elements of exposure, where the patient remembers aspects of what is anxiety provoking or fear provoking, with the therapist helping them to process and deal with that. Because if you keep avoiding, you can't what's called extinguish. You can't extinguish the fear. And so avoidance in general tends not to work, but it's very, very natural.
So to deal with fear, a large part of that is just facing it. Does it get worse?
It can get worse. You can compound it. And I think getting back on your horse is very important. One thing I like is the way I think of it, it may be a slightly different horse, but at least you're getting back on it.
Oh, I like that. There can be some gradient there. You can say there's levels of exposure.
Yeah. Yes.
So in your research, and maybe you've already touched on it, but if I were to look at the 80-20 or kind of macro attribute, is there one skill or attribute or something that if I were to focus on would be the most important when it comes to developing resilience in my life, or that makes the others easier to acquire?
I would say a combination of two. One being a real focus on social connectedness, meaningful social connectedness. Because what happens is, if I have a really close group of friends and colleagues and so forth, I tend to become more of an active coper, which tends to be more successful than passive coping, because I know somebody has my back. There's even data to show that it modulates my stress response more if I have a social group that I can trust. And I tend to see threats as being less threatening. I would say developing the social network in combination with finding real role models, some of whom may be in your social group, who you admire for their ability to negotiate adversity in a way that we might call resilient. And then to literally study these role models. And you can even, if it's somebody you can ask them, that's what we did. We asked all of these highly remarkable resilient people. We said, well, how did you do it? And slowly but surely, we kept hearing the same themes over and over again. And we came up with these 10 factors, which social science and neuroscience tended to back up a lot. But I think role models are extremely important. And one of my role models has become some of my forefathers, who I didn't know about until doing this book. For some reason, I started looking at it. I had two Lawrence and Cassandra Southwick came over from England in 1620 or something. And they were Puritans. And they came for religious freedom and so forth. Well, one day, And they were respected in the little community. I can't imagine coming over, and at that time there was nothing, no 7-Elevens, no nothing. But anyway, one day a couple came and needed a place to stay, so they stayed at Lawrence and Cassandra's house. But the Puritan community did not like this. So much for religious freedom. And Lawrence and Cassandra eventually became Quakers, and so they were imprisoned. All of their possessions were taken. Their son was tied to an ox cart and paraded through different towns being whipped. The Puritan community tried to sell their 2 youngest children as slaves to Barbados, but none of the ship captains would take them. And eventually they got banished and found a little boat, somehow made it along the Atlantic coast to Shelter Island, and died of the elements. Now, the reason I mention this is that I don't know Lawrence and Cassandra, but I know about them now. So my long-term partner will say to me when I'm beginning to wimp out on something or, complain a little bit, she'll say, Lawrence and Cassandra, their moral courage and their toughness and their resilience. And I'll go, yeah. And we can all find role models in our own. Anybody who lived 200 years ago compared to today is resilient.
First of all, I'm going to, with your permission, use Lawrence and Cassandra as my role model. I'm going to put them in the list. But also, it makes me think of how this wonderful time period that we live in and the modern luxuries we enjoy tend to make us weak.
Yes, definitely.
We tend not to appreciate where we are and how we are, but it also lowers our tolerance for a warm temperature, cold temperature. I was just thinking about everything they went through, and it's like, God, that was life. And here we are. We complain if we stump our toe and
exactly. And they had the
tripping over going to the kitchen to get our hamburger. Right?
Exactly. And they had the opportunity, if they just renounced their Quaker faith, they would have been released and so forth. And they said no. But what you're saying is really important in our opinion, with raising your children, because you're right. We've so sort of overprotected our children, at least in America for the most part, not everybody. But you want to find this balance between, you don't want to neglect, but you don't want to overprotect. Yeah. And there's a wonderful pediatrician named George Winnicott, and he coined the term the good enough mother. And it applies to the good enough father, the good enough coach, the good enough mentor. And by good enough, he meant the best. So good enough is the best. And what good enough means is, I know when my kid or mentee or whatever is in over their head. I'm observant. I'm trying not to let them get really overwhelmed. But I'm also not going to overprotect them. I'm going to let them experiment, challenge themselves, fail, regroup, and so forth. So it's hard to be a good enough parent, because you're like, oh, Johnny, you really want to protect your kid, but you're not really doing your kid a favor.
So we need to be aware now how we're making ourselves fragile by isolating, right? Not trying to avoid things that we fear. All of these things are going to rebound against us when we're faced with really tough challenges or something very, very difficult. So we need to be aware of it now, build up our social network, go out, make friends, increase that type of contact, and be aware of, the little things that upset us or make us fret, right?
Challenge ourselves, learn to meditate, learn how to recover, learn how to quiet down your nervous system, but also challenge yourself. The military is incredibly good at stress inoculation, getting tougher, tougher, tougher. But I'm not sure they were, until more recently, as good at helping the soldier to come back to baseline quickly. And so the military is now teaching things like yoga and Tai Chi and mindfulness and so forth, realizing that you've got to come back to baseline.
I like to challenge anybody out there who poo-poos meditation and mindfulness. I just like to say, give it a try. I doubt you can do it. In other words, I've done a lot of difficult things in my life, physically, and it is tough to be quiet for 10 minutes. And that is a skill. It is tough to put up with yourself. So I want to say, anybody who thinks it's, mamby-pamby or whatever it is, I dare you to try it. It's tough.
That's a good example. To become resilient, you have to train. And mindfulness is training. You're training by doing it the best you can over and over. You're training your brain to come back to baseline much more rapidly, which is a big part of resilience.
This has been fantastic. So first of all, I'm going to push people to wherever that book is sold, Amazon, Google Play Books, or wherever. Go to your bookstore. Where can they find you online?
I don't really have a website, but just my email. That's fine.
Stephen, thank you so much we finally made it. See?
Yeah, we made it.
We persisted, right?
That's right.
We were resilient. For everybody listening, there was some back and forth and we missed each other. And thank you so much. I'd like to include you as, in my network, and I'd still like to talk to you some more. And
I'll be delighted anytime. Seriously. Okay. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Well, that's a wrap. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed it, do share it with your friends and on your social platforms. Big thanks to Sam Williams, my audio guy, and the beautiful bumper music you're hearing is Michael Petrovich's Bella Luna. For all my show notes or resource links, visit LarryWeeks.com, and we will talk again soon.